So you're talking about substantial amounts of money when you're talking about a dozen to 2 dozen origins with multiple shipments per year. We're talking millions of dollars. And that's where the entry into the CPG sector started.
Mahesh Hari is a serial entrepreneur with a passion for creating impactful, sustainable businesses.
If you're building your own company, it has value to meet people.
He specializes in working with natural product CPG brands in sectors like food, beverage, nutrition, and beauty. His expertise lies in solving complex supply chain issues and fostering growth for companies focused on sustainability, such as those involved in upcycling, recycling, and direct trade.
So essentially 70 to 80% of the food we eat on a weekly basis.
Could you please tell us a little bit about what led you here?
I think I've always had sort of an entrepreneurial mindset without realizing it at times in the beginning of my career. But long story short, had a couple ventures as a teenager. I sat to myself and I thought, okay, if money didn't matter, how would I want to spend my time? And traveling the world was obviously one of the goals, controlling my own time and partaking in like the global business realm. International business was interesting because I grew up in 5 countries and that just was ingrained in, wanting to explore the world and a fascination with how the global economy works. When I was in Belize randomly, I was exposed to the food sector and through the revered cacao bean, the Mayans revered it, but multi-billion dollar chocolate industry. I met these farmers out in the southwest of the jungles of Coxcomb National Park in San Antonio, Belize. And I think I got a little bit of inspiration there. A few months later, I explored a coffee farm in India, and I just started doing a deep dive into how big these industries were and how marginalized the producers. 70 to 80% of the global food producers so essentially 70 to 80% of the food we eat on a weekly basis was grown below someone living below poverty level in their local area. I'm not comparing it to US standards. And that was quite eye-opening to me. I was mind blown. You walk into the grocery store, you're not thinking about where this food came from or that these bananas were flown in from Ecuador, and it's right there. We're not thinking about it. We just go to pick up our dozen bananas or half dozen bananas. And I felt like the cacao, coffee, and tea industry was a good place to try to make an impact because people pay premium money for it and it's grown by marginalized producers. Wine is a little bit more difficult because they're probably one of the richest producers, right? The vineyards are quite well-to-do generally. So that's where that was the entry point to what I've been doing for the last 6 years. And I think my motto is sort of grow your company based on the pain points you're solving. And so even though my original idea was to displace these coffee companies and cacao companies globally who are essentially quasi banks, some of them are, they're hedging shipments by investing in the ICE exchange, the Intercontinental Exchange, and they're moving, tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, because we're talking about, multi-billion dollar industries between coffee, cacao, and tea. And the goal was to create a direct trade system where middlemen are cut out. And because of the higher quality food space that's been sort of developing over the last 5 to 10 years, you can go into a coffee shop and pick coffee from Ethiopia or Guatemala or, whatever origin you want. And so I saw an opportunity to do that. And it was growing quite well. And then COVID hit just, before this interview, you were telling me about your experience and COVID hit and we were stuck with, a large inventory. Obviously there are many businesses who deal with inventory and I'm not saying it's a bad space. It just wasn't right for me. So even though we still do sell coffee, cacao, and tea, we started going more into the service, which is managing supply chains and building the sales pipelines for these companies rather than being responsible for the capital needed to fund these shipments, which each container was over $100,000. And that's a 20-foot container, right? So you're talking about substantial amounts of money when you're talking about a dozen to 2 dozen origins with multiple shipments per year. We're talking millions of dollars of inventory. And that's where the entry into the CPG sector starts, which is what I do today. And so we do we work with natural product companies, which are essentially raw materials, just like green coffee, cacao beans, tea, and other high-end products. But our main customer base is generally comprised of innovative companies who are seeking to benefit the world via better food for human consumption, building more sustainable models for food transportation and food production, or treating the human capital in a better capacity, meaning paying them more appropriately, and or upcycle previously thrown away food products that they're now using to make amazing human consumable products. And we also help these companies succeed via retail and online. And generally, they can get a little too caught up in the supply chain improvement or innovation, and it makes it hard for them to work on the business. So we take that headache away from them and help them succeed. And that's sort of my motto and goal, is to build a better, world through food production and consumption.
A noble goal. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. There's a lot of fascinating insights just from that intro that I hadn't considered. Perhaps focusing on supply chain, what role is technology playing in modernizing supply chains and I guess particularly in the CPG supply chains, and which technologies are having the most significant impact?
I think implementing production technologies in US manufacturing facilities or offshore manufacturing facilities are quite interesting. It just requires a revamp, right? And I'm sure you've noticed, and maybe listeners have seen, but from restaurant to retail, there's a whole overhaul of products happening right now. It's been happening for the last, half decade or so, and it's going to continue to happen. But, any grocery store you walk into, there's probably all types of new products, from cacao water to, obviously kettle cooked chips had their rise a couple of years ago. Now there's all sorts of like protein chips, and I think Hippie is the brand. They make puffs with like chickpeas. And so and all these products require changes in the manufacturing process. And it can be difficult to find the manufacturers, even if you have a goal. Oh, I want to make, chickpea chips, just like Hippie probably, had to go through this learning curve. I don't know when they started, but I think for people who are looking to make an impact in, any sector or the food and beverage space, it can be a daunting task to find these manufacturers who will succeed in creating the finished product. Obviously, our transport, marine freight, air freight, and land freight, I think there's been a lot of technological advancements, but besides the invention, if I can call it that, of the container, which massively improved the global shipping sector with like literal 20-foot, 40-foot containers on ships, I can't say that there's a massive change in impacting like food and beverage supply chains. Pretty much all of our food, unless it's lab made, like flavoring and citric acids and whatever, it is grown from the ground. And so there are a lot of technologies being implemented in the like raw material production. I mean, I can give a couple examples, but it's a little bit of a conundrum because there is production automation, or harvesting automation, I should say, where humans are being replaced, right? And that displaces their workload, but it's just way more efficient. So I think in the specialty agricultural sector, humans will still be relevant, but I don't see how long it's going to last with machines being able to pick 10, 20x of whatever, fruits, berries, wheat, whatever it may be, the raw material. Automation is definitely blowing up.
I see. Yeah. Thank you for that insight. How are companies integrating blockchain technology into their supply chains? And can you speak at all about some of the benefits and challenges of doing so?
Yeah, so I think there's, actually, one of your guests, Luke Kim, he introduced me to a gentleman who is trying to implement blockchain technology in cacao production in Puerto Rico. And there's a huge problem with chocolate consumption these days because a lot of chocolate has heavy metal presence, and it's because the cacao bean absorbs it from soil that contains heavy metals, just like turmeric. And a lot of people are having turmeric lattes, ginger turmeric shots, and whatnot. And if they don't have certificates of analysis, high chance you're just shooting up, taking shots of heavy metals with that turmeric. And obviously that exists in the seafood industry as well, heavy metal toxicity with too much seafood consumption. But this gentleman is building a blockchain solution for production tracking and producer tracking, which is happening in other origins like Cameroon, where it allows people to know that, like, which producer was actually producing XYZ product, and tracing tracing the transparency in the supply chain, because there's a lot of lack of transparency, and that's where smart contracts have been playing a big role, and even just fundraising, right? Knowing exactly, like, hey, we put in $1 million into this production in Puerto Rico. Where is it being allocated, and tracing the actual implementation of said funds. Those are, I think, sectors where blockchain has been playing a big role. I think there's also a lack of education. I mean, it's evolving every day, and so bringing this to experts' attention is probably, by experts, I mean people who are educating themselves and they're on the forefront of this technology. I think those are the people who need to be involved in food production. And food production is, that's vitality. That's at least 2 to 3 times a day people are eating, unless they're intermittent fasting. So it's a massive, massive, massive industry. Yeah, I think a lot more experts need to shed light on the space and get involved, because getting non-experts involved, I think it's a shot in the dark.
Yeah. I'd like to pivot a bit to talk about the logistical challenges of managing a global supply chain. And what are some strategies for managing relationships with global suppliers and supply chain efficiency?
Yeah, so global suppliers, I think there's a lot of, with the existence of the internet, a lot of things have changed. There's some cool companies, for people looking to launch like clothing brands. There's some pretty interesting companies on social media who are sharing contacts of these manufacturers. Building it today is 10x, I don't know, multiples easier than a decade or 2 or 3 ago. So there's a lot of opportunity online, but sometimes you just got to get on that plane. And if it's manufactured in the US, go fly to that state, call the manufacturer, call 10, boil it down to 2, and go fly to them. It's still, I've done business with many people who I've never met in person, but if you're building your own company, it has value to meet people, right? Go shake their hand, see what you're getting into, learn a little bit about what you're diving into, unless you have previous experience, right? And that goes for any manufacturer. I highly recommend at least once. And in the contrast of like startup costs, you're talking about $500 to $3,000 round trip. It's, in my eyes, it's relatively negligible in terms of, or it's a small ratio of the total startup. Even if your startup cost is like $25K, spend $2,000 on that round trip flight to go meet your suppliers or manufacturers, whether they're domestic or international.
Yeah, with like tariffs and changing regulations.
So I try to provide information, but there's not a lot of companies like ours that do it at this level. We work with sub 0 to $35 million annual revenue companies. Obviously, there's some huge management consulting companies that have arms that support corporations with building better supply chain systems. But again, there's a huge surge of CPG startups, right? And I think a lot of them are trying to solve all these problems by themselves, and it stunts their growth, right? You can talk to air freight companies, marine freight companies, ground freight companies, material sourcing. You may need cases, shrink wrap, can tops, bags, boxes, whatever, right? And talk to brokers. If you want to do all the legwork yourself, talk to brokers, and you can manage the supply chain in-house. And some brands need to probably do in-house supply chain management. But a lot of other companies, your growth is coming from getting out there and selling your product, right? Sales cures all, right? And so I don't know what other companies exist out there like ours, like madnab.com, but go find them, come to us or go find them and then seek their support, and they'll bring a lot more efficiencies over to you. Unless have a background in the space, then obviously you can leverage that and have an in-house supply chain sort of focus. And I'm sure those individuals have a little bit more of a clarity and an idea on how to go forth with building their supply chains. But yeah, I would say, again, don't try to do everything yourself. I think a lot of founders get caught up in that, and generally you're not paying upfront. And that's where the big difference comes in. This isn't something you're getting caught up on a 10 grand a month retainer, right? Usually you can get these companies on a pay by service sort of model is generally what I've seen.
How can CPG companies balance sustainability goals with cost efficiency in their supply chains? And what are some of the most successful sustainability initiatives you've seen implemented in the CPG supply chain?
Yeah, so the bottom line is when the costs go up, the end product price goes up. And I think the long-term goal for the world should be to make these more affordable. But I'm sure, have you heard of Erewhon groceries?
I don't think so.
So Erewhon. They're sort of this, people make fun of them because it's I would say one of the most high-end grocery stores in the country or world. And then they're known for some outrageous pricing on products. But generally speaking, their products are probably, 20 to 40% higher than other stores. But the pricing is, in my eyes, justified because they're doing the legwork for customers to be able to walk in the doors and not really have to worry about what they're putting into their body. And so that price premium you're paying is for them to go do that work. And they're constantly doing that work, right? And that's the unfortunate part, is to be healthy, to live healthy, you have to allocate a certain portion of your monthly budget towards food consumption, right? Buying supplements, or now people are like biohacking and cold plunging. Some people have $8,000 cold plunges at home, and that's a big financial allocation, right? Not everybody can afford these things, just your monthly grocery budget. And I think the end goal should be a world where better food is more affordable. But the bottom line is, if you're trying to innovate, one company is called Diaspora, and they have a lot of herbs and supplements, or not supplements, sorry. Yeah, a lot of herbs like turmeric, peppers, but all their products have certificates of analysis, and they have a transparent supply chain. And I think it's a female founder who leads the company, but their turmeric's $11.99, but it's incredible, right? And it's also heavy metal tested. And whereas you can probably go into the grocery store and get one for $3.99, and it's just a matter of like prioritization of where the funds go. But I think for right now, I've seen some companies struggle with making affordable products, but they haven't reached economies of scale where this is viable. So they're trying to, save the world, so to speak, or create a better product for human consumption, but they're also competitively priced to these unhealthy products. And I think it really strains these companies. I'm not saying don't do it, but, founders are a beast of their own. And there's no right or wrong for some founders because people just figure it out. But unfortunately, I just think your retail price has to set a little bit higher, which leads to consumer education as to why the consumer should pay that price. And that it is difficult. It is difficult. But I think without it, it's going to, it's already a tough world to eat healthy without spending money. And I think a lot of innovation has to happen in order to have that as our end goal for humanity. And it is I'm not even, I think this is just real, right? It's just real. And there's so many influencers online saying, did you know this product actually had XYZ? Don't eat this. Don't eat oats with glyphosate. Make sure you get organic oats. And it's like, you have to also be educated and constantly educate yourself just to eat properly. It's a shame.
You bring up a lot of really interesting points. The consumer education part, the communication of value. I think when people understand that, it's a no-brainer. And then they realize they're actually not paying more, they're saving more. Because like you mentioned, like what is the cost of ingesting poison over a decade or two? Even if you escape cancer or something like that, it could just be diminished energy, for example. And what would your life be like if you had greater energy, greater focus, etc.? So, I mean, you are what you eat, as the adage goes. So, yeah, I could see how, being able to outsource that and just have it built in, almost like tips being like built into the bill that's due. It's like that's just built into your groceries. I think that's very attractive the way that you put it.
Yeah, and it's, there's a difference between fear mongering and educating consumers. The tough part is for companies, education costs a lot of money unless, they have some virality or whatever. So I think, right now, I think founder-led stories are your most cost-effective for a startup or even a company sub, few $1,000,000. That's your most effective way to storytell and educate people, because marketing gets very, very expensive, whether it's retail or online. And sometimes the budget allocation isn't there until, you raise or you're at sort of a larger stage in your company, right? And so, yeah. And once consumers are educated, they that is the start of a different journey, but it can be expensive to educate.
How do you think the CPG supply chain will evolve over the next decade? And what advice would you give to those looking to stay ahead of industry trends?
I think there's probably going to be more centralized companies who are supporting CPG brands or just all food and beverage brands in general, right? Or natural product CPG brands. And so I think there's going to be companies who present the solution that we present more. There's a really cool company called Startup CPG, which is a great resource for any companies in the CPG sector. They have a lot of information sharing, a lot of founder support, and they try to consolidate by having like Startup CPG booths with multiple brands at events like Expo West and Expo East and Fancy Food Show and whatever, because those can be cost 10, 20, 30,000 just to attend with the smallest booth. But I don't know. I think I don't know what to expect over the 10 years because a lot of new things are happening. And I think that's the fun part, right? If I knew it, then, or anyone said they completely knew what was going to happen, I think that would be a sad day, I think, because that would mean the end of innovation. There's so many fascinating spaces. There's a gentleman, I forget his name, but he left SpaceX, I believe, and he started these food production laboratories to essentially grow all types of food and reduce carbon emission and create more sustainable food production. And I don't know what products they've released now, but they started with cheeses, lab-grown cheeses, and they have like lactose-free options and things like that. But that's their CPG product, but the company's really a food production laboratory.
Okay. Um, fair answer. So you'd mentioned a company, Diaspora, dealing with spices, and I'm looking at their website, and they talk about how they're paying farmers an average of 3 to 5 times the commodity price. And I know that that's something you yourself are really passionate about. I was wondering if you're able to share at this point any wins that you've been able to provide some of the people on the ground to get more of the cut of the product that they're sourcing.
So we did a media project called sourcesmag.com about this, but I'll give it one example with, coffee and cacao production in Cameroon. And this gentleman named Matif Foncha sort of leads this project. I believe it's called Camera and Boyo. Their goal is to create a direct trade supply chain from the roasters or cafes all over Europe, Korea, the United States, Canada, and the cafes try to educate consumers on who actually they have a transparent supply chain, and they are pretty successfully able to track who actually, like, let's say you open up a bag, they have a way to track that back to the farmer who actually grew it, or which location in Cameroon that actually came from. And so that allows for the money to be actually transferred back from the cafe all the way over to the farmer. And again, cutting out all these middlemen, because tons of companies make money in buying and selling cacao, coffee, tea, right? And Cameroon being a cacao and coffee production origin, these farmers I don't have the numbers in front of me, so I don't want to like throw some ambiguous number, but they're making substantially more than the commodity pricing. And, something is better than nothing because it's a starting point. But just to give people clarity on what commodity pricing means, like fair trade coffee, for example, it's better than non-fair trade, but there are many companies doing direct trade. And fair trade essentially means that it is X number of cents above the commodity pricing. That commodity pricing, unfortunately, can still be extremely low. It just prevents them from getting practically paid nothing when the market is down. And so there's financial, companies who are trading in the ice markets constantly, but that's what dictated historically what raw materials were purchased. And so if the market was down, producers globally, including the US and Canada, are affected, right? And so they're seasonal, right? All food production is somewhat seasonal. And so they have no control over these. They could work as hard as last year and get paid 50% of what they got paid last year just because the markets are. And so fair trade essentially means it's paid slightly above that. But there's a lot of I think there's some terms coined like farm to table, which makes more sense, like if you live in LA, for example, and it was grown 2 hours away or an hour away, farm to table is more viable there. But it's harder to do farm to table from, Thailand. It's a little bit more of a complex supply chain process. But generally, sometimes the word direct trade is utilized there. But if companies like Diaspora are able to share that transparency, I think it's a great start.
Yeah, thank you for that explanation. So basically, fair trade is somewhat ambiguous, and the worst case, it might be equivalent to wait staff being tipped like 2 pennies, rather than like direct trade seems to be a little bit more equitable, a little more balanced. Is that right?
Yeah, and I'm not bashing fair trade. I'm just saying, there are better systems to develop. It is difficult for more pure commodities, right? Special commodities that have become specialty or specialty agricultural goods, that's more viable because you can actually turn around to the end consumer and charge $6 for a pour over, for example, as opposed to $2 for the drip coffee, right? Because they're paying more for that. But that's tougher and this is happening in commoditized products, but it's tougher for something like, chickpeas or, purely commoditized products, because then you have to turn around and charge the customer more. And then society starts panicking, they're like, oh my God, food prices are going up. And hopefully that's because they're paying more. But if they're just, charging more because supply chain costs are going up, that's inevitable. That's a tough sort of situation. But yeah, so it is tough to increase these payments to farmers if you're not able to sell it for a higher price, because then you're doing it, practically might as well be a nonprofit.
Mm-hmm. I see. Well, Mahesh, this has been very enlightening. Thank you so much for sharing a lot of your experience with us, or some of a lot of your experience with us. Is there anywhere that you would like? You mentioned some great companies. We'll definitely mention those in the show notes as well as yours. Is there anywhere that you'd like to point people in addition to that so they can follow what you're doing?
Yeah. So I've just recently become somewhat active on LinkedIn. So people can find me at Mahesh Hari, Mahesh. And my last name is Hariharan. And then, of course, people can just go to madnav.com. I try to help as much as I can for free. So I'm always happy to support people who are looking to make an impact on the world. So reaching out there or just maheshamadnab.com, feel free to reach out to me. And I'm happy to give some insight, education, share any experience just to, get people going.
Great. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, David. Appreciate it.